Welcome back. Tonight we're delving into one of archaeology's most captivating mysteries, the curse that allegedly followed the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. As always, let me know where in the world you're listening from. Get cozy, settle in, and let's begin. The whispers of an ancient warning. The desert wind carries secrets across the sands of Egypt. For millennia, these secrets lay buried beneath layers of limestone and time, protected by silence and darkness. But in November of 1922, that silence was broken. The seal of a tomb, untouched for over 3,000 years, was breached. And according to legend, something else was released alongside the musty air and golden treasures. Something unseen. Something that would claim lives. The story of Tutankhamun's curse has captivated imaginations for over a century now. It speaks to our deepest fascinations and fears, the idea that some things should remain hidden, that the dead demand respect, that ancient powers still hold sway in our modern world. But what really happened after Howard Carter's team opened that tomb in the Valley of the Kings? Was there truly a curse etched into the walls, waiting to punish those who dared disturb the young pharaoh's eternal rest? Or were the deaths that followed merely coincidence, exaggerated by sensationalist newspapers hungry for compelling stories? Tonight, we'll walk through the sand and dust of that discovery. We'll meet the people involved, examine the deaths that spawned the legend, and explore both the supernatural claims and the scientific explanations that have emerged over the decades. This is a story that bridges the ancient and modern worlds, a tale where golden masks and deadly fungi intertwine, where fact becomes stranger than fiction. The Valley of the Kings sits on the western bank of the Nile, across from the modern city of Luxor. In ancient times, this was Thebes, the great religious capital of Egypt during the New Kingdom. The valley itself is a desolate place, a winding canyon carved by ancient flash floods, its walls rising steeply on either side. The limestone cliffs shimmer with heat during the day, and at night the temperature drops dramatically, leaving the air crisp and still. It was here, in this barren landscape, that Egypt's most powerful pharaohs chose to be buried for nearly 5 centuries, from approximately 1539 to 1075 BC. The choice of location was deliberate and sacred. The western bank of the Nile, where the sun set each evening, was associated with death and rebirth in Egyptian cosmology. Just as the sun god died each night only to be reborn at dawn, so too would the pharaohs transition through death to eternal life. Rising above the valley is a natural pyramid-shaped peak called Al-Qurn, which means the horn in Arabic. To the ancient Egyptians, this mountain resembled their sacred symbol of rebirth and resurrection, the pyramid. Its presence watching over the hidden tombs below added divine significance to an already spiritually charged location. By the early 20th century, most archaeologists believed the Valley of the Kings had been exhausted. Tomb after tomb had been discovered, documented, and sadly plundered. The great American excavator Theodore Davis, who had sponsored digs in the valley for over a decade, declared in 1912 that there were no more tombs to be found. The valley, he announced, was finished. But one man disagreed. A stubborn, brilliant, and somewhat prickly Englishman named Howard Carter believed there was at least one tomb that remained undiscovered, and he was determined to find it, no matter how long it took. The Boy King. A life cut. Tragically short. Before we can understand the discovery and the curse that allegedly followed, we need to understand the young man whose tomb would become the most famous archaeological find in history. Tutankhamun was not a mighty warrior pharaoh. He conquered no vast territories. He built no towering monuments. His reign lasted barely a decade, and he died when he was still a teenager. By all rights, history should have forgotten him. He was born around 1341 BC in a time of tremendous upheaval in Egypt. His birth name was Tutankhamun, meaning the living image of the Aten, and that name tells us much about the world he entered. His father was Akhenaten, one of the most controversial pharaohs ever to rule Egypt. Akhenaten had done something almost unthinkable. He had abandoned the traditional pantheon of Egyptian gods, gods who had been worshipped for thousands of years, and elevated a single deity above all others. The god Aten, represented as a sun disk whose rays ended in small hands, was declared the one true god. Akhenaten closed the temples of Amun, Osiris, Isis, and all the other deities. He dismissed their priests and confiscated their wealth. He even moved the capital from Thebes to a new city he built in the desert, a place called Akhetaten, modern-day Amarna. This religious revolution sent shockwaves through Egyptian society. The priests of Amun, who had wielded immense power and influence, suddenly found themselves without authority. The people, who had grown up honoring multiple gods for every aspect of life, were confused and angry. Into this tumultuous world, young Tutankhamun was born. The identity of his mother remains uncertain, though DNA analysis has suggested she may have been a sister of Akhenaten, as royal incest was common practice to keep bloodlines pure. What we do know is that the boy grew up in the artificial city of Amarna, surrounded by the art and ideology of his father's monotheistic revolution. But Akhenaten's reign could not last forever. When the revolutionary pharaoh died after about 17 years on the throne, Egypt was left fractured and weakened. The abandonment of the old gods had not brought the promised prosperity. Foreign relations had deteriorated. The economy struggled. And so, after a brief and murky period involving possible co-regents named Smenkhkare and Neferneferuaten, the crown passed to a child. Tutankhamun ascended to the throne when he was only 8 or 9 years old. Imagine that, a child barely old enough to understand the weight of divine kingship, suddenly responsible for governing one of the ancient world's great civilizations. Of course, he did not rule alone. 2 powerful men stood behind the boy king, guiding his decisions and wielding the real authority. One was I, the Grand Vizier, possibly Tutankhamun's maternal grandfather. The other was Horemheb, the commander-in-chief of the military, a stern and capable general who had kept Egypt's armies together during the chaos of Akhenaten's reign. These advisors understood what the young pharaoh perhaps could not yet grasp. Egypt needed to return to its traditional ways. The people needed their gods back. The priests needed their temples restored. And so, in the 3rd year of his reign, momentous changes were enacted. The royal court moved from Amarna back to Memphis, the ancient capital. The temples of Amun were reopened and richly endowed with gifts. The priesthoods were restored to their former positions of honor. And the young pharaoh changed his name. No longer Tutankhamun, the living image of the Aten. Now he was Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun. This simple act of renaming signaled to all of Egypt that the old order had returned, that the gods had forgiven their people, that stability would be restored. On what is now called the Restoration Stela, inscriptions proclaim the young king's dedication to setting right what had been broken, to repairing the temples, to ensuring that the gods once again smiled upon the land of Egypt. Despite this important work of restoration, Tutankhamun's reign was relatively quiet. There is evidence of military campaigns against Egypt's enemies to the north and south, but the young pharaoh likely did not personally lead these expeditions. He was too young and perhaps too frail. Modern analysis of his mummy has revealed a host of health problems. He suffered from a cleft palate, a club foot that would have required him to walk with a cane, and likely endured chronic pain from various bone disorders. These afflictions were probably the result of royal inbreeding, as his parents were almost certainly siblings. Tutankhamun married his half-sister Ankhesenamun, who was slightly older than him and the daughter of Akhenaten and the famous Queen Nefertiti. Theirs was a marriage of duty and political necessity, as royal marriages so often were. But there are hints of genuine affection in some of the artwork found in the tomb. One scene on the back of a golden throne shows Tutankhamun seated, while Ankhesenamun stands before him, her hand raised in a gesture of tenderness. The sun disk of Aten shines down upon them both, a remnant of the religious revolution they had inherited but moved away from. This golden throne is one of the most beautiful objects found in the tomb, and the scene depicted upon it offers a rare glimpse into the personal relationship between the young king and queen. Unlike most royal art, which shows rulers in formal, distant poses, this image suggests intimacy. Ankhesenamun's gesture is protective, almost motherly, despite being his sister and wife. Tutankhamun sits in a relaxed posture, one arm draped over the armrest. Both wear elaborate collars and jewelry, but their faces show individual character rather than idealized features. The presence of the Aten sun disk in this image is significant. By the time most of the tomb furnishings were made, Egypt had officially returned to worshiping the traditional pantheon. Amun had been restored to supremacy. The priests of the old gods were back in power, yet this throne, clearly commissioned during Tutankhamun's reign, still shows the Aten. It suggests that the break with Akhenaten's religious revolution was perhaps not as complete or sudden as official propaganda suggested. Or perhaps the throne was made early in Tutankhamun's reign, before the restoration of the old gods was complete. The personal effects found in the tomb paint a picture of a young man who enjoyed both the ceremonial aspects of kingship and more ordinary pleasures. There were board games, including the popular game of Senet, which was not merely entertainment, but had religious significance as a representation of the soul's journey through the afterlife. There were musical instruments, including trumpets and harps, suggesting that music was part of royal life. There were writing implements indicating that Tutankhamun, like other pharaohs, was literate. Most poignant, perhaps, are the items related to childhood, small chairs that would have fit the boy king when he was very young. Toys and games, these remind us that for all the ceremony and responsibility, Tutankhamun was just a child when he became pharaoh, thrust into a role he could not have fully understood. The young couple tried to secure the royal line. Archaeological evidence has revealed the tiny mummified remains of two stillborn daughters, both premature, both buried in miniature coffins within Tutankhamun's tomb. The grief these losses must have caused can only be imagined. With no surviving children, with no heir to continue the dynasty, the political situation remained unstable. And then, around 1323 BC, when he was approximately 18 or 19 years old, Tutankhamun died. The exact cause of his death has been debated by scholars for decades. Early examinations of his mummy revealed a hole in the back of his skull, leading to speculation that he had been murdered, perhaps struck from behind by someone seeking the throne. Later, more sophisticated analysis using CT scans suggested this damage occurred after death, perhaps during the mummification process. Other theories have emerged. He had a broken leg, the fracture visible in the scans, and some researchers believe this injury became infected, leading to deadly gangrene, or sepsis. DNA analysis detected the presence of malaria in his system, suggesting he may have been fighting that disease at the time of his death. His various congenital conditions would have left him with a weakened immune system, making him more vulnerable to infections that a healthier person might have survived. Whatever the cause, his death appears to have been sudden and unexpected. His tomb, which would have been prepared over many years for a pharaoh expecting a long life, was clearly not ready. The small size of the tomb, the hasty way some of the decorations were completed, the evidence of rush and improvisation, all suggest that when Tutankhamun died, there was a frantic scramble to prepare a suitable resting place. The tomb that should have taken decades to construct and fill with treasures was prepared in approximately 70 days, the traditional period of mummification. Workmen labored around the clock to carve the chambers, plaster the walls, paint the scenes that would guide the young king to the afterlife. Meanwhile, the embalmers worked on the body, removing organs, drying the flesh with natron salt, wrapping the mummy in hundreds of yards of linen, placing protective amulets between the layers. When at last the burial was ready, A solemn procession carried Tutankhamun through the Valley of the Kings to his final resting place. Priests performed the opening of the mouth ceremony, magically animating the mummy so that the pharaoh could eat, speak, and breathe in the afterlife. Then the tomb was sealed, the doorways plastered over and stamped with the necropolis seal. The entrance was buried under rubble and chips of limestone, hidden from view. And there Tutankhamun lay, in the darkness, in the silence, surrounded by everything he might need in eternity. There he remained, forgotten by history, erased from the official records by later pharaohs who wanted no reminder of the Amarna period and its religious upheaval. For over 3,000 years, he slept in his hidden tomb. Until Howard Carter came looking. The Valley of the Kings, a landscape of death and glory. To understand why Carter's discovery was so remarkable, we must first understand the Valley of the Kings itself and the long history of exploration, plunder, and archaeology that preceded the finding of Tutankhamun's tomb. The valley is not a single straight corridor, but rather a complex system of wadis, dry riverbeds carved by ancient flash floods millions of years ago. The main valley, what archaeologists call the East Valley, stretches northeast from the base of a prominent ridge. Here, the majority of the 60-plus known tombs are located. A smaller West Valley branches off, containing only a handful of tombs, but including the burial place of Ai, who succeeded Tutankhamun as pharaoh. The rock here is predominantly limestone, layer upon layer of sedimentary deposits, laid down when this region was covered by an ancient sea some 35 to 56 million years ago. Between these limestone layers are softer bands of marl and shale, which made the carving of tombs both possible and challenging. The rock was soft enough to cut with copper tools, yet durable enough to support the weight of the mountain above. This geological reality shaped how tombs were constructed. The ancient Egyptian workers, using copper chisels, wooden mallets, and stone pounders, would carve down into the valley floor, creating a stairway or a sloping corridor that descended into the rock. The work was done by candlelight or oil lamp once they got beyond the entrance, creating a hot, smoky, oxygen-depleted environment. The workers labored in shifts, one group chiseling, while another hauled out the limestone chips in baskets. The deeper they went, the more challenging the work became. Ventilation was a constant problem. Shafts had to be cut to bring fresh air to the workers. The heat increased with depth, as did the risk of encountering underground water or hitting pockets of unstable rock. Some tombs took years or even decades to complete, representing tens of thousands of hours of dangerous, exhausting labor. The walls, once carved to the desired dimensions, were plastered with a layer of gypsum mixed with limestone dust. This created a smooth surface for painting. Artists worked in the same hot, dark conditions as the stone cutters, their work illuminated by flickering lamps that cast shadows and made it difficult to judge colors accurately. Yet the paintings they created are masterpieces of precision and beauty, with hieroglyphic texts that contain no errors and figures that maintain perfect proportions. The artists worked in teams, following established conventions that had been refined over centuries. The most senior artist would sketch the basic compositions in red ochre, laying out the positions of figures and the lines of text. Junior artists would then refine these sketches in black, correcting proportions and adding details. Finally, painters would fill in the colors, working with palettes limited to red and yellow ochres, black carbon, white gypsum, and a few precious blues and greens made from imported minerals. Every detail in these tomb paintings had meaning. The colors were not arbitrary. Gold represented the flesh of gods, eternally incorruptible. Green symbolized rebirth and regeneration. Blue was the color of the Nile and of lapis lazuli, associating the deceased with life, giving water, and precious materials. The figures' positions, gestures, and the objects they held all conveyed specific ritual or mythological significance that would have been immediately understood by ancient viewers. The ancient Egyptians chose this location with great care. Its isolation made it easier to guard against tomb robbers, though, as we shall see, that proved insufficient protection. The presence of the natural pyramid, Al-Qurn, gave the site sacred significance. And the western location, on the side of the Nile, where the sun set, aligned with Egyptian beliefs about death and rebirth. The first pharaoh known to be buried here was Thutmose I, around 1500 BC, though some scholars argue that Amenhotep I may have preceded him. Thutmose's advisor, a man named Eneni, left an inscription boasting about the secrecy of the tomb's construction, stating that he oversaw the excavation alone, with no one seeing and no one hearing. This secrecy was meant to protect the royal burial from the thieves who had plagued earlier monuments. For nearly 500 years, from the 18th dynasty through the 20th dynasty, pharaohs continued to be buried in the valley. The tombs grew more elaborate over time. What began as relatively simple corridors leading to burial chambers evolved into vast underground labyrinths with multiple corridors, side chambers, pillared halls, and burial rooms. The walls were covered with scenes from the afterlife texts, the Book of the Dead, the Book of Gates, the Book of that which is in the underworld. These texts and images were not mere decoration. They were magical guides, instruction manuals for the perilous journey the deceased pharaoh would undertake through the netherworld. But despite all precautions, despite the secrecy and the remote location and the guards posted at the valley entrance, the tombs were robbed. Sometimes within years or even months of the burials, thieves burrowed into the tombs, smashed open the coffins, tore the gold from the mummies, and made off with everything portable and valuable. Ancient Egyptian records preserve accounts of trials for tomb robbery, with thieves confessing under torture to breaking into royal burials. By the time Greek and Roman tourists visited the valley in the first centuries BC and AD, most of the tombs were already open and stripped of their treasures. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus visited around 60 BC and described finding nothing but the results of pillage and destruction. The modern era of Egyptology began in the early 19th century. European explorers and adventurers, drawn by tales of ancient wonders, began systematically exploring the valley. Giovanni Belzoni, a former circus strongman turned antiquities hunter, discovered 8 tombs between 1816 and 1817, including the spectacular tomb of Seti I. John Gardner Wilkinson created a numbering system for the tombs in the 1820s, a system still in use today, where each tomb is designated with the prefix KV for King's Valley, followed by a number in the order of modern discovery. Victor Loret discovered 16 tombs in the late 19th century, including a cache of royal mummies hidden in the tomb of Amenhotep II. These mummies had been moved there in ancient times by priests trying to protect them from robbers, all packed together in a side chamber like refugees fleeing disaster. And then came Theodore Davis, the wealthy American lawyer who financed extensive excavations from 1902 to 1914. Davis's teams made numerous important discoveries, finding tombs, caches of artifacts, and tantalizing hints that more remained to be found. Among the items his team uncovered were broken pieces of furniture and other objects bearing the name of Tutankhamun. These fragments suggested that the young pharaoh had indeed been buried somewhere in the valley. But where? Davis and his team searched extensively, but never found the intact tomb. By 1914, convinced that the valley had yielded all its secrets, Davis relinquished his excavation permit and returned to America. He died in 1915, never knowing how close his teams had come to the discovery of the century. Later investigation revealed that Davis's workers had walked right over the entrance to Tutankhamun's tomb, buried beneath rubble from the excavation of the nearby tomb of Ramesses VI. This is where Howard Carter enters the story. Carter had been working in Egypt since 1891 when he arrived as a 17-year-old artist, hired to make drawings of tomb reliefs and inscriptions. He had no formal training in archaeology or Egyptology, but he possessed an artist's eye for detail, an obstinate determination, and an instinctive understanding of how the ancient builders had thought. Carter's background was humble by the standards of Victorian archaeology, which was largely the domain of wealthy gentlemen scholars. He was born in 1874 in Kensington, London, the youngest of 11 children. His father was an artist specializing in animal paintings, and young Howard showed early talent in drawing. But the family's modest means meant that formal education was limited. What Carter lacked in academic credentials, however, he made up for in raw talent and determination. His first job in Egypt came through family connections. Percy Newberry, a respected Egyptologist, needed someone to copy inscriptions and reliefs at Middle Kingdom tombs near Beni Hassan. Carter's artistic skills made him perfect for the task, even though he knew almost nothing about Egypt or its history when he arrived. He was thrown into the deep end, learning hieroglyphs on the job, studying Egyptian art styles by copying them, absorbing knowledge through immersion rather than formal instruction. This unconventional education shaped Carter's approach to archaeology. He did not come to the field with preconceived theories or academic frameworks. Instead, he developed a practical, empirical understanding based on direct observation. He learned to read the landscape of the Valley of the Kings, to understand how ancient builders chose tomb locations, to think like the architects and workers who had carved these monuments. Carter's personality was complex, marked by both brilliance and brittleness. He was intensely private, never married, and formed few close friendships. Colleagues described him as meticulous to the point of obsession, demanding perfection from himself and others. He could be prickly and difficult, quick to take offense, slow to forgive. The incident at Saqqara that cost him his job exemplified both his principled nature and his inability to navigate political situations diplomatically. The years after losing his position with the Antiquities Service were difficult. Carter barely scraped by, selling watercolors to tourists, serving as a guide for wealthy visitors, doing odd jobs related to antiquities. He might have drifted into obscurity, another talented person whose career never quite launched, if not for his fortuitous meeting with Lord Carnarvon. The partnership that developed between these two men was remarkable precisely because they were so different. Carnarvon was aristocratic, educated at Eton and Cambridge, wealthy beyond measure. Carter was middle class, self-taught, living hand to mouth. Yet they formed a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared passion for discovery. Carnarvon provided the money and social connections. Carter provided the expertise and obsessive drive. Together, they achieved what neither could have accomplished alone. Carter worked his way up through the ranks of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, eventually becoming Chief Inspector of Antiquities for Upper Egypt. He made several important discoveries and earned respect for his careful, methodical approach to excavation. But his career came to an abrupt halt in 1905 after an incident known as the Saqqara Affair. French tourists at the Saqqara site got into an altercation with Egyptian site guards. Carter, who was present, sided with the guards and defended their actions. The resulting diplomatic crisis cost him his job. For several years, Carter struggled, selling watercolors to tourists and doing odd jobs related to antiquities. Then, in 1907, he met George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, a wealthy British aristocrat who had come to Egypt for his health after a serious automobile accident. Carnarvon had developed an interest in archaeology and was looking for someone knowledgeable to oversee excavations on his behalf. The partnership between Carter and Carnarvon would become one of the most famous collaborations in archaeology. Carter brought expertise, experience, and an unshakable conviction that one tomb, at least, remained to be found in the Valley of the Kings. Carnarvon brought money, social connections, and a genuine enthusiasm for ancient Egypt. Together, they would change history. The long search, years of dust and disappointment, When Carter and Carnarvon began their systematic search of the Valley of the Kings in 1917, World War I was still raging across Europe and the Middle East. Carter himself spent part of the war years working as a diplomatic courier and translator for the British government. But by late 1917, he was back in the valley, ready to begin the most ambitious search of his career. Carter's plan was elegantly simple, but would require tremendous labor and patience. He would systematically excavate down to bedrock a triangular patch of valley floor that other excavators had ignored or only partially explored. This area, he calculated, was one of the few remaining spaces in the valley that had not been thoroughly investigated all the way to the bottom. If Tutankhamun's tomb existed, and if it had somehow escaped discovery, it would most likely be found here. The work was backbreaking. Carter borrowed a small railway track and trucks from the Egyptian Antiquities Service. His team of local workmen, the unsung heroes of so many archaeological discoveries, used picks and hoes to break up the compacted debris, filled baskets with the loose material, and dumped it into the trucks. The loaded trucks were then pushed along the rails to dump sites outside the valley. Day after day, week after week, season after season, they moved tens of thousands of tons of material. The Valley of the Kings in those days looked nothing like the relatively tidy archaeological site it is today. Previous excavators had simply piled their spoil wherever it was convenient, creating artificial mountains of rock chips and debris, some rising 20 or 30 feet high. Before Carter could even begin excavating his chosen area, he first had to move these earlier spoil heaps. It was archaeology as demolition and construction work combined. And for years, the effort produced nothing. No hidden stairway, no sealed doorway, no tomb, just more rock, more dust, more disappointment. Season followed season with diminishing returns. The First World War ended. Life slowly returned to something resembling normalcy. But still, Carter found nothing. By 1922, Lord Carnarvon's patience and fortune were both wearing thin. He had financed 6 years of excavation with no significant results. His friends teased him about his archaeological obsession. Other Egyptologists whispered that Carter was wasting Carnarvon's money on a fool's errand. The tomb simply was not there. Theodore Davis had been right. The valley was exhausted. That summer, Carnarvon invited Carter to his estate, Highclere Castle, in England. The meeting's purpose was clear. Carnarvon intended to end their partnership and cease funding the excavations. It had been a noble effort, but it was time to accept defeat. But Carter was not ready to give up. With the desperate eloquence of a man facing the collapse of his life's ambition, he made his case. There was one last area that required investigation, he explained. A small section of valley floor near the entrance to the tomb of Rameses VI. This area was cluttered with ancient workmen's huts, built by the laborers who had carved Rameses's tomb. No one had fully excavated beneath those huts. And that, Carter insisted, was where Tutankhamun must be. We do not know exactly what was said in that conversation, but somehow Carter convinced Carnarvon to fund one more season. Just one. If nothing was found, Carter would accept defeat and abandon the search. Carnarvon agreed, perhaps more out of affection for his friend than any real hope of success. Carter returned to Egypt in October 1922, arriving earlier than usual for the excavation season. The workmen's huts near the Rameses tomb entrance would have to be carefully recorded and photographed before they could be removed. This was archaeology after all, not treasure hunting. Even insignificant structures had to be properly documented. Work began on November 1st. The huts were recorded, their locations measured and mapped. Then, with great care, they were taken apart and the debris beneath them removed. On November 2nd, more debris. November 3rd, still nothing but rock chips and dust. And then, on November 4th, a date that would echo through the history of archaeology, a worker uncovered a step. Just one step, cut into the bedrock and buried under centuries of accumulated debris. Then another step appeared beneath the first, and another. Carter immediately ordered the work stopped and the stairway filled back in to protect it. He sent a telegram to Lord Carnarvon in England, simply stating that he had made a wonderful discovery in the valley, a magnificent tomb with seals intact. Carnarvon was to come at once. While waiting for his patron's arrival, Carter must have been in an agony of anticipation and doubt. Was this truly an intact royal tomb? Or was it perhaps just another cache of materials moved from elsewhere? The suspense must have been nearly unbearable. Carnarvon, along with his daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert, immediately booked passage to Egypt. The journey from England took nearly 3 weeks. Carter waited, pacing, rechecking his security arrangements, allowing himself, perhaps, to hope. On November 23rd, Carnarvon and Lady Evelyn arrived in Luxor. The very next day, work resumed. The full stairway was revealed, 16 steps in all, though the lowest 6 had been cut away at some point to maneuver large objects through the doorway. At the bottom stood a plastered doorway, stamped with ancient seals. Carter examined those seals with racing pulse. They showed the jackal god Anubis above 9 bound captives, the traditional seal of the royal necropolis. This was indeed an official burial, and miraculously the seals appeared to be intact. But were they? Looking more closely, Carter could see evidence that the doorway had been opened and resealed at least twice in antiquity. Tomb robbers had been here. His heart sank. Perhaps all the treasures were gone. Only one way to find out. On November 25th, in the presence of Lord Carnarvon, Lady Evelyn, and his assistant Arthur Callender, Carter broke through the sealed doorway. Beyond it lay a rubble-filled corridor stretching into darkness. The rubble was itself a hopeful sign. The ancient authorities had filled the corridor to deter robbers. Perhaps they had succeeded. The next day, November 26, 1922, the rubble was cleared. At the far end of the corridor stood another sealed doorway. Carter made a small hole in the upper left corner, just large enough to insert a candle. He peered in. "Can you see anything?" Carnarvon asked from behind him, unable to contain his impatience. Carter's reply would become one of the most famous quotes in archaeology. Yes, wonderful things. In the flickering candlelight, Carter could make out the glint of gold everywhere. Strange animal shapes, statues, a chaos of treasures piled and stacked and crammed into the small chamber. This was no robbed tomb. This was the discovery of a lifetime. November 1922, opening the door to eternity. The moment Howard Carter peered through that hole and saw those wonderful things marked the beginning of what would become one of the most carefully documented excavations in archaeological history. But on that first evening, in the dim candlelight, with adrenaline and excitement coursing through their veins, Carter and his colleagues simply stared in wonder. The circumstances of that moment deserved deeper consideration. Carter had spent years searching for this tomb. He had endured skepticism from colleagues, dwindling financial support, the harsh conditions of working in the valley during scorching summers and surprisingly cold winters. He had moved literally tons of debris. He had come within days of giving up entirely. And now, on what was meant to be his final season, with Lord Carnarvon having reluctantly agreed to fund just a few more months of work, Carter had found what he sought. The emotional weight of that discovery cannot be overstated. When Carter enlarged the hole in the doorway and Carnarvon joined him at the opening, when both men gazed into that chamber for the first time, they were not merely archaeologists examining a new find. They were witnesses to something that defied ordinary experience. For over 3,000 years, no living eyes had seen what they were seeing. The air they were disturbing with their breath had been sealed away since the reign of Akhenaten's successors. Consider what it must have felt like to know that you were the first person in recorded history to look upon these objects, that the ancient priests who had arranged these treasures, who had performed the final rituals and sealed the doorway, had done so believing no one would ever see them again. The intended audience for this magnificent display was not human, but divine, meant for the gods who would receive the pharaoh in the afterlife and for the pharaoh's own spirit as it journeyed through the underworld. Carter later wrote about the peculiar sensation of looking at things that seemed to exist in a kind of time capsule, frozen in a moment from the distant past. The fingerprints of the ancient workers were still visible in some of the plaster. Where priests and officials had walked, their footprints remained in dust on the floor. A wreath of flowers placed on the outermost shrine as a final gesture of mourning still retained traces of color despite the millennia. These were not abstract antiquities. These were the remnants of actual people's lives, of real grief, real ceremony, real belief. What Carter could see was what he would later call the antechamber, a room roughly 26 feet long by 12 feet wide. But it looked smaller because it was so densely packed with objects. There were couches shaped like fantastic beasts, their sides covered in gold leaf, with legs carved to resemble the limbs of lions, cows, and mythological creatures. There were chairs and stools, some inlaid with ivory and ebony. Boxes and chests were stacked haphazardly. White painted jars stood in rows. And everywhere the gleam of gold caught the light. The next day, with electric lights rigged up by calendar, the full extent of the chamber became visible. On the northern wall stood 2 life-size statues of the pharaoh, made of wood but covered in black resin and dressed in gold kilts. They faced each other like sentinels, guarding a sealed doorway between them. This doorway led to the burial chamber itself, where Tutankhamun's mummy would be found. On the southern wall was another opening, this one without a door, leading to a smaller room that Carter would call the annex. This room was in even greater chaos than the antechamber, with objects piled and thrown about as if by someone in a great hurry. Carter immediately recognized that this was not, strictly speaking, an untouched tomb. The evidence of ancient robbery was clear. The doorways had been broken through and resealed. In the antechamber, someone had disturbed the careful arrangement, rummaged through boxes, and left fingerprints in the ancient dust. The annex showed signs of even more hasty searching. But crucially, the thieves had been caught and stopped before they could reach the burial chamber. Most of the treasures remained. Carter faced a monumental task. There were, by his initial estimate, several hundred objects in the antechamber alone, many of them fragile, all of them precious and irreplaceable. Each one would need to be photographed in place, carefully conserved if necessary, wrapped and boxed, carried out through the narrow doorway and up the steep stairs, and transported to a secure facility for proper examination and storage. For this work, Carter assembled a team of specialists unmatched in the history of Egyptology. Harry Burton, a photographer from the Metropolitan Museum's Egyptian expedition, would document every stage of the excavation. His photographs, taken with large format cameras and glass plate negatives, would create an invaluable record. Arthur Mace, also from the Metropolitan Museum, would handle conservation of delicate objects. Douglas Derry would examine any human remains. Alfred Lucas, a chemist, would analyze materials and develop new conservation techniques as needed. Alan Gardner would work on translations of any texts. The excavation of the tomb would take 10 years. 10 years of painstaking, careful work, removing objects one at a time, solving conservation problems as they arose, documenting everything with meticulous precision. Carter's obsessive attention to detail, his refusal to rush, his insistence that everything be done properly, these qualities transformed what could have been mere treasure hunting into genuine scientific archaeology. The first season, in late 1922 and early 1923, focused on clearing the antechamber. Each object had to be photographed where it lay. Burton would set up his cumbersome camera and flash equipment, calculate exposures, take multiple shots from different angles. Only then could an object be touched. Many items required stabilization before they could be moved. Textiles had deteriorated over millennia. Wooden objects had warped or cracked. Gold leaf had separated from its backing. Lucas developed treatments using paraffin wax to consolidate fragile materials. On November 29th, the tomb was officially opened in the presence of Egyptian officials and invited dignitaries. This was a political as well as archaeological moment. Egypt, though still technically under British influence, had declared partial independence in February 1922. The question of who controlled access to the tomb and its treasures would become a source of tension. Lord Carnarvon, seeking to profit from the discovery and control the narrative, sold exclusive reporting rights to the London Times. This decision would cause tremendous resentment among other newspapers, not just British, but Egyptian and international. Only Arthur Merton of the Times was allowed on site. His vivid descriptions of the wonders being revealed generated worldwide attention, but also anger from journalists who felt excluded. As winter turned to spring in 1923, the work continued. One by one, the treasures emerged from the tomb. Dismantled chariots, their wheels and axles carefully packed away in ancient times. Alabaster vases, their translucent stone carved so thin that light could pass through. Furniture inlaid with glass and faience in brilliant blues and reds and golds. Boxes containing everything from writing equipment to linens to games. Jars of precious oils, their contents long since dried and solidified. And jewelry, breathtaking jewelry, gold collars and pectorals set with semi-precious stones, bracelets and rings, earrings and diadems. Each object told a story. The chariots had been used during Tutankhamun's lifetime. Wear marks on the wheels showed they had been driven, not just ceremonial. The walking sticks, over 100 of them, suggested the physical difficulties the young king had faced. Many of the staff showed signs of actual use. The sandals, some made of gold, but others of woven plant fiber, ranged from ceremonial to practical. By mid-February 1923, the antechamber was nearly empty. The moment had come to open the sealed doorway to the burial chamber. But before that could happen, a rift developed between Carter and Carnarvon, apparently over how to handle the Egyptian authorities and the press. The excavation was temporarily halted. Work resumed only after Carnarvon apologized. On February 16, 1923, with dignitaries once again in attendance, Carter removed the blocking from the doorway between the guardian statues. Beyond lay the burial chamber, and within it, something that took even Carter's breath away. A golden shrine, or rather a wall of gold, filled nearly the entire room, leaving only a narrow corridor around its sides. This was the outermost of 4 nested shrines, boxes within boxes, all hammered from cypress wood and covered entirely in sheet gold. Inside these shrines, Carter would eventually discover, lay a quartzite sarcophagus. Inside the sarcophagus were 3 nested coffins in human shape. The outer 2 were made of wood covered in gold leaf and inlaid with colored glass and semi-precious stones. But the innermost coffin, the one that actually held the mummy, was solid gold. It weighed 110 kilograms, or about 243 pounds of pure gold. Its value in gold alone would have been astronomical, but as a work of art, as a piece of human history, it was beyond price. And on top of the innermost coffin, placed directly over the face and shoulders of the mummy, rested the object that would become the single most recognizable artifact from ancient Egypt, the golden funerary mask of Tutankhamun. 22 pounds of solid gold, beaten and shaped into the serene, idealized face of a young man, with inlaid eyes of quartz and obsidian that seemed to gaze into eternity. The blue stripes of the royal headdress were made of lapis lazuli glass. Protective cobra and vulture, symbols of Upper and Lower Egypt, adorned the brow. The mask was more than decoration. It was a crucial part of the burial ritual, providing a permanent backup face for the dead king should his actual flesh decay. Carved on its back and shoulders in hieroglyphs that seemed to shimmer in the light was a spell from the Book of the Dead. magical words to protect and guide the deceased through the dangers of the underworld. But the burial chamber held more than the shrines and coffins. On the eastern wall was another small doorway, leading to what Carter called the treasury. This room contained the canopic shrine, housing the 4 internal organs of the king, removed during mummification and placed in miniature coffins of their own. There were model boats to carry the king across the celestial waters. Boxes contained shabtis, over 400 servant figures who would magically come to life and perform any labor required of Tutankhamun in the afterlife. And there, at the entrance to the treasury, stood a life-size statue of Anubis, the jackal god of embalming, mounted on a carrying pole like a portable shrine, watching over the king's most precious possessions. Every few months, Carter and his team would pack up their tools, secure the tomb, and travel to Cairo or back to England, giving themselves time to rest, to plan the next phase of work, to arrange for conservation of objects already removed. The excavation was not a continuous process, but a carefully paced marathon. The work required patience beyond what most people could imagine. Consider, for instance, the challenge of removing the golden shrines from the burial chamber. These shrines, 4 of them nested one within another like Russian dolls, filled almost the entire room. There was barely space to walk around them, let alone to dismantle them safely. Each shrine weighed hundreds of pounds and was constructed of wooden panels covered in delicate gold leaf. The panels had been assembled inside the burial chamber during the funeral, fitted together with tenons and mortises, and then the doorway had been sealed. To remove them, Carter essentially had to work in reverse. He had to figure out how the ancient workers had assembled these massive structures in such confined spaces, and then carefully take them apart panel by panel, documenting each piece, wrapping it for protection, and carrying it out through the narrow passages. A single mistake could damage irreplaceable artifacts. The pressure was immense. The conservators faced similar challenges with nearly every object. Ancient textiles, for instance, had become so fragile that they would disintegrate at a touch. Lucas developed techniques using paraffin wax to stabilize the fabric, essentially creating a supportive matrix that would hold the fibers together during handling. This had to be done while the textile was still in place, before it could be moved. Wooden objects presented their own problems. After 3,000 years in the tomb's stable environment, the wood had reached an equilibrium with its surroundings. Removing these objects into the much more variable conditions outside the tomb could cause them to crack, warp, or even disintegrate. Each piece had to be gradually acclimatized, spending time in progressively less controlled environments before being moved to final storage. The golden objects, while more durable than organic materials, still required careful handling. Gold leaf is remarkably thin, thinner than paper in many cases. Any rough handling would cause it to flake away from its backing. Where the adhesive had deteriorated over the millennia, sections of gold leaf were barely attached. These areas had to be consolidated before the objects could be safely moved. And during one of these breaks, in early April 1923, something happened that would transform this already remarkable archaeological discovery into one of the most famous stories of the 20th century. Something that would give birth to a legend that persists to this day. Lord Carnarvon fell ill, and a few days later, he died. The first death, Lord Carnarvon and the birth of a legend. George Edward Stanhope Molyneux. Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, had never been a particularly healthy man. In 1901, he had been in a serious automobile accident in Germany. His car had overturned, and he suffered severe injuries, including lung damage. The accident left him with breathing difficulties for the rest of his life. He was prone to frequent respiratory infections, and his doctors had originally recommended he spend winters in Egypt specifically because the warm, dry climate would be easier on his lungs than the damp cold of England. So it was perhaps not entirely surprising when, in mid-March 1923, Carnarvon fell ill in Egypt. While staying in Aswan, he was bitten by a mosquito. A mosquito? Such a tiny thing, such a common occurrence in Egypt, but Carnarvon, while shaving, accidentally cut the mosquito bite. The wound became infected. In 1923, antibiotics did not yet exist. Penicillin would not be discovered until 1928 and would not be widely available until the 1940s. A bacterial infection, once it took hold, had to run its course. The body either fought it off or it did not. Carnarvon's body could not fight. The infection spread, causing blood poisoning. He developed pneumonia, his already weakened lungs succumbing to the bacterial assault. He was transported to the Continental Savoy Hotel in Cairo, where his condition worsened daily. His wife, Lady Almina, and their son, Lord Porchester, rushed to his bedside. On April 5, 1923, at around 2 a.m, Lord Carnarvon died. He was 57 years old. The cause of death was officially recorded as pneumonia supervening on erysipelas, a streptococcal infection of the skin and underlying tissue, with blood poisoning contributing to multi-organ failure. The death of a wealthy British aristocrat in Cairo would normally have merited a brief obituary. But this was Lord Carnarvon, the financial backer of the most spectacular archaeological discovery in history. This was the man who had stood with Howard Carter when they first peered into Tutankhamun's tomb. His death became immediate worldwide news. And then the stories began. The novelist Marie Corelli, a popular writer of sensationalist fiction, had written a letter to the press before Carnarvon's death. In it, she claimed, without any evidence whatsoever, that ancient Egyptian tombs often contained dire warnings and curses that would fall upon anyone who disturbed them. She asked ominously whether the infection Lord Carnarvon was suffering from could be related to breaking into the tomb. After Carnarvon died, Corelli went further. She told newspapers that she had read in an ancient Arabic text that dire punishment would follow any rash intruder into a sealed tomb. The media seized upon this. Headlines screamed about curses and vengeance from beyond the grave. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes and a prominent believer in spiritualism, gave an interview in which he suggested that Carnarvon's death might have been caused by elementals, supernatural beings created by Egyptian priests specifically to guard the tomb. These elementals, Conan Doyle theorized, might have somehow caused Carnarvon to be bitten by the mosquito, and then ensured the bite became infected. The story grew even more elaborate with each telling. It was said that at the exact moment of Carnarvon's death, all the lights in Cairo mysteriously went out. Simultaneously, back in England, at Highclere Castle, Carnarvon's beloved dog, Susie, supposedly let out a great howl and died. These details were reported as fact by newspapers around the world, despite no contemporary documentation confirming either event. Did the lights really go out in Cairo? Cairo's electrical system in 1923 was notoriously unreliable, with frequent power outages. Even if there had been a blackout that night, attributing it to supernatural causes rather than the normal vagaries of early 20th century infrastructure required a considerable leap of faith. As for the dog, the only evidence for this story comes from later recollections, with no contemporary account mentioning it. But the press did not care about verification. They had a story too good to check. A story of ancient curses, of pharaonic vengeance reaching across 3,000 years to strike down the man who had dared disturb the tomb. The curse of the pharaohs, the mummy's curse, the curse of Tutankhamun. By whatever name, it had been born. Howard Carter, meanwhile, was devastated by his friend and patron's death, but he also found the curse talk ridiculous and offensive. He wrote dismissively about the superstitious nonsense being spread by sensationalist newspapers. There was no curse. There had never been any curse inscribed in the tomb. The only inscription remotely resembling a warning was found on a clay brick elsewhere in the valley, and it was a standard protective formula asking guardians to protect the tomb, not threatening intruders. The Egyptian authorities were equally annoyed by the curse stories. Egypt was trying to establish itself as a modern nation, and tales of ancient curses and mummy vengeance played into colonialist stereotypes about backwards, superstitious natives. Pierre Lecoq, the French director of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, made public statements denying any curses and insisting that all proper precautions had been taken to ensure the health and safety of everyone working in the tomb. But the public wanted to believe, and when more deaths followed, when other people connected to the tomb's opening began to die, the legend of the curse grew stronger. The skeptics were drowned out by the believers, and the curse of Tutankhamun entered global popular culture, where it remains to this day. A trail of deaths. The curse claims more victims. If the story had ended with Lord Carnarvon, the idea of a curse might have faded relatively quickly. A single death, however dramatic, could easily be explained by natural causes. But over the following years, other people connected to the excavation began dying, and each death added fuel to the curse narrative. The 1920s were a peculiar time in Western culture, particularly in Britain and America. The First World War had just ended, having killed millions and shattered the certainties of the Victorian and Edwardian ages. The war had been mechanized, industrialized, impersonal in its slaughter. Poison gas, machine guns, artillery barrages, these had turned warfare into something that seemed stripped of meaning or glory. The survivors emerged shell-shocked, literally and figuratively, searching for meaning in a world that suddenly seemed arbitrary and cruel. At the same time, there was tremendous interest in spiritualism and the occult. The Society for Psychical Research, founded in 1882, had gained considerable respectability by the 1920s. Seances were popular entertainment among the upper classes. Prominent intellectuals, including Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, believed they could communicate with the dead. The boundaries between science and superstition seemed more permeable than they do today. Into this cultural moment came the story of Tutankhamun's tomb and the alleged curse. It offered something the modern world seemed to lack: consequences, meaning, the idea that actions mattered in some cosmic sense. The war had been random slaughter, but the curse suggested a more ordered universe where violations of sacred boundaries brought punishment. It was simultaneously frightening and comforting. The newspapers of the era understood this instinctively. They did not merely report deaths. They crafted narratives, drawing connections, building suspense, creating an ongoing serial story that kept readers coming back for more. Each new death was presented as another chapter in the curse saga, complete with dramatic headlines and lurid illustrations. George J. Gould I was an American railroad magnate and financier, son of the legendary robber baron Jay Gould. In early 1923, after Carnarvon's death, but before it had been widely attributed to a curse, George J. Gould visited Egypt specifically to see the tomb. He was given a tour by Howard Carter, descending into the chambers and viewing the treasures that were being carefully cataloged. Within weeks of his visit, Gould developed a fever. He traveled to the French Riviera to recuperate, but his condition worsened. He died on May 16, 1923, little more than a month after Carnarvon and barely 6 weeks after visiting the tomb. The newspapers reported his death as another victim of the curse. Medical records indicate he died of pneumonia, but the coincidence of timing seemed too striking to ignore. Sir Archibald Douglas Reed was a radiologist who was invited to X-ray Tutankhamun's mummy before it was handed over to the Egyptian authorities. The first X-ray examination of a pharaoh was an exciting prospect combining cutting-edge modern technology with ancient history. Reed traveled to the tomb, performed the X-rays, and returned home. In January 1924, Reed died in Switzerland. He was only 52 years old. The official cause of death was complications following abdominal surgery related to the metastatic spread of cancer. But the curse believers pointed out that he had been in perfect health before visiting the tomb. The The fact that he had cancer was, they argued, irrelevant. The curse had somehow initiated or accelerated the disease. Arthur Mace, the Metropolitan Museum conservator who had worked so closely with Carter on preserving the delicate artifacts, began experiencing health problems in 1924. He complained of exhaustion and weakness. His condition deteriorated steadily. He died in 1928 at age 53. The cause of death was listed as pleurisy, an inflammation of the lungs. But Mace had been healthy and active before working in the tomb. Had he inhaled something? Breathed in ancient dust that damaged his lungs? Richard Bethel was Lord Carnarvon's secretary and had been among the first to enter the tomb chambers. He died in 1929 under mysterious circumstances, found smothered to death in his room at an exclusive London gentlemen's club. He was only 45. The death was ruled a suicide, but no clear motive was ever established. Some modern historians have suggested the death might have been connected to the occultist Aleister Crowley, who had his own complicated relationships with people in Egyptological circles, but this remains speculation. Making Bethel's death even more eerie in the eyes of curse believers was what happened next. His father, Lord Westbury, threw himself out of a 7th-floor window in London in February 1930, dying instantly. At Lord Westbury's funeral, the hearse ran over a young boy in the street, killing him. 3 deaths connected to Richard Bethel within months. Surely this was evidence of a curse spreading like ripples in a pond? The newspaperman Arthur Weigel, who had served as Chief Inspector of Antiquities before Carter took that role, had been among those present at the opening of the burial chamber in February 1923. Weigel had made a comment to another journalist while watching Lord Carnarvon laughing and joking as he entered the tomb. "I give him 6 weeks to live," Weigel said, apparently as a criticism of Carnarvon's irreverent attitude. 6 weeks later, Carnarvon was dead, making Weigel's comment seem eerily prophetic. Weigel himself died in 1934, age 54, of what was described as a sudden illness. Prince Ali Kamalfami Bey of Egypt was not directly connected to the excavation, but he had visited the tomb at some point after its opening. In July 1923, he was shot and killed by his wife at the Savoy Hotel in London. The shooting occurred after a violent argument, and his wife was acquitted of murder on grounds of self-defense. The curse believers added him to the list anyway. He had visited the tomb, he had died violently and unexpectedly. Therefore, the curse. Sir Lee Stack, the British Governor-General of Sudan, was assassinated in Cairo in 1924. He had been present at some point during the excavation activities. His death was clearly political, carried out by Egyptian nationalists opposed to British colonial rule. But again, he had been connected to the tomb, and he had died. The curse did not discriminate between natural death and political murder, or so the argument went. The list grew longer with each passing year. Scholars and journalists compiled catalogs of deaths, sometimes stretching the definition of connected to the tomb to absurd lengths. Had someone visited Egypt around the same time as the tomb's discovery? Connected? Had they met Howard Carter at a dinner party? Connected. Had they simply expressed interest in Egyptology? Connected. And when they died, from whatever cause and however many years later, it was attributed to the curse. Joel Wolfe, a British businessman who had visited the tomb, died of fever aboard a ship in 1924. Sir Archibald Douglas Reed's assistant, who had helped with the X-rays, died under unclear circumstances. Hugh Evelyn White, a British archaeologist who had worked at various sites in Egypt, hanged himself in 1924, leaving a note saying he had succumbed to a curse. Though White had not been involved with Tutankhamun's tomb specifically, his suicide note mentioning a curse was enough to add him to the tally. By the 1930s, the list of alleged curse victims numbered in the dozens. Newspapers kept running tallies, treating each new death as confirmation of ancient Egyptian magic's reality. Books were published cataloging the deaths and arguing for supernatural explanations. horror movies featuring mummy curses became a staple of cinema. The 1932 film The Mummy, starring Boris Karloff, though fictional, drew directly on the Tutankhamun curse legend and helped cement it in popular imagination. But was any of it real? Or was this simply a case of selective attention, where deaths that could be linked to the tomb were highlighted while the many survivors were conveniently forgotten? The scientific explanation: when ancient tombs become biological hazards. As the years passed and the curse legend continued to grow, a few scientists and medical researchers began asking different questions. Rather than accepting or debunking the supernatural aspects of the curse, they wondered whether there might be a scientific explanation for at least some of the deaths. Could ancient Egyptian tombs harbor genuine biological hazards? Might there be real dangers lurking in these sealed chambers, dangers that had nothing to do with magic, but everything to do with microbiology? The idea began to gain traction in the 1970s, following an incident that had nothing to do with Egypt. In 1973, a group of 12 scientists opened the tomb of King Casimir IV Jagiellon in Poland. Casimir had been a beloved and progressive king who died in 1492, after which his body was wrapped in silk, covered with calcium salts, and sealed in a wooden coffin. The coffin had been moved several times over the centuries, but had remained sealed for nearly 500 years. Understanding what happens in a sealed tomb or coffin requires some knowledge of microbiology and environmental science. When a tomb is sealed, an enclosed ecosystem is created. Whatever microorganisms are present at the time of sealing, whether on the body, in the soil, on the offerings and grave goods, become trapped in this closed system. Some of these microorganisms will die off quickly as conditions change. But others, particularly fungi and certain bacteria, can enter dormant states that allow them to survive for centuries or even millennia. These dormant forms, particularly fungal spores, are remarkably resilient. They do not need much in the way of nutrients. They can survive extreme dryness, heat, cold, and even radiation that would kill active organisms. They essentially go into a state of suspended animation, their metabolic processes slowed to nearly zero, waiting, and they can wait a very long time. In a tomb sealed for centuries, these spores accumulate. They settle on every surface. They infiltrate the porous materials like wood and fabric. They become part of the dust that coats everything, and they remain dormant because the sealed environment, once it reaches equilibrium, does not change. There is no influx of new oxygen, no fluctuation in temperature or humidity, nothing to trigger the spores into activity. But when the tomb is opened, everything changes. Fresh air rushes in. The humidity shifts. Light enters for the first time in centuries or millennia. And most importantly, the spores become airborne. Anyone entering the tomb or standing near its entrance as it is opened will inhale these spores by the thousands or millions. For most people, this poses no problem. The immune system recognizes foreign particles and neutralizes them. But for someone with a weakened or compromised immune system, these spores can be deadly. When the archaeologists finally opened it in 1973, they found King Casimir's remains in remarkable condition, the mummification having been effective. But within days, 4 of the 12 scientists fell seriously ill. Over the following weeks and months, 6 more died. 10 of the 12 researchers who had opened that tomb died within a short period of time. The pattern was impossible to ignore. A microbiologist named Boleslaw Smyk was called in to investigate. He took samples from the tomb and its contents and made a disturbing discovery. The coffin was riddled with 13 different types of fungi, including a particularly dangerous species called Aspergillus flavus. This fungus produces toxic spores that can cause a disease called aspergillosis in humans, primarily attacking the lungs. For people with weakened immune systems, aspergillosis can be deadly. The spores can remain dormant for centuries, preserved in the dry, sealed environment of a tomb or coffin. When the tomb is opened and fresh air rushes in, the spores become airborne. Anyone breathing near the tomb inhales them. In healthy individuals, this might cause nothing more than mild respiratory irritation. But in someone whose immune system is compromised, the spores can germinate in the lungs, growing into a mass of fungal tissue. The infection can spread to other organs. It can cause internal bleeding. It can, and often does, kill. This discovery in Poland led researchers to reconsider the Egyptian deaths with new eyes. Could something similar have happened in Tutankhamun's tomb? The environmental conditions were certainly right. The Valley of the Kings is extremely dry, perfect for preserving organic materials, including fungal spores. The tomb had been sealed for over 3,000 years, creating an isolated microenvironment. When Carter broke through those seals, whatever had been growing inside would have been disturbed for the first time in millennia. Laboratory studies of ancient Egyptian mummies have confirmed that many do indeed carry dangerous fungi and bacteria. Two species in particular, Aspergillus niger and Aspergillus flavus, have been found in multiple tombs and on mummified remains. Both can cause aspergillosis. Both can be deadly to people with compromised immune systems. But Aspergillus is not the only hazard. Research has identified numerous other pathogens that can survive for centuries in tombs. Pseudomonas and Staphylococcus bacteria have been found on tomb walls. Both can cause serious respiratory infections. They can lead to pneumonia, sepsis, and death. Scientists have also detected various gases in sealed sarcophagi and tomb chambers. Ammonia gas can form from the decomposition of organic materials. So can formaldehyde. Hydrogen sulfide, a compound that smells like rotten eggs, has been found in some tombs. In sufficient concentrations, these gases can cause burning eyes and throat, breathing difficulties, and in extreme cases, loss of consciousness or death. Another fungus found in bat droppings can cause a disease called histoplasmosis. Bats are known to have inhabited many Egyptian tombs, including possibly Tutankhamun's. When archaeologists disturb a tomb, they disturb any bat colonies living there, and they stir up centuries of accumulated guano. The fungus in the dried droppings becomes airborne. Inhaling the spores can cause symptoms remarkably similar to those Lord Carnarvon experienced before his death: fever, enlarged lymph nodes, pneumonia, and in severe cases, death. Looking back at the deaths attributed to the curse through this scientific lens, some of them begin to make more sense. Lord Carnarvon had severely compromised lungs from his automobile accident. He would have been particularly vulnerable to respiratory infections. If he inhaled fungal spores or bacteria while in the tomb, his weakened immune system might not have been able to fight off the resulting infection. A study published in the medical journal The Lancet examined this possibility specifically. The researchers noted that Carnarvon first entered the tomb on November 26, 1922. His infection began in mid-March 1923, about 3.5 months later. At first glance, this seems too long to be connected. Most infections manifest within days or weeks, not months. But the researchers pointed out that Aspergillus spores can remain dormant in the lungs for extended periods before being activated. Something as simple as another illness, even a cold, could trigger the dormant spores to germinate, causing active infection. The progression from there could be rapid. Within days, the person could be seriously ill. Within weeks, they could be dead. Other deaths on the curse list fit this pattern. Arthur Mace, the conservator who spent months working in the tomb handling ancient materials that might have been covered in spores, died of lung disease. George J. Gould visited the tomb and died of pneumonia weeks later. Sir Archibald Douglas Reed, though his immediate cause of death was cancer, had visited the tomb shortly before his health collapsed. It is important to note that not all scientists accept the biological hazard theory as a complete explanation. Some point out that Aspergillus is relatively common in the environment. People breathe in these spores all the time without getting sick. Only those with severely weakened immune systems are at significant risk. And while some of the tomb-related deaths involved people with known health problems, others occurred in apparently healthy individuals. Moreover, extensive testing of Tutankhamun's tomb for pathogens has yielded mixed results. A 2013 study led by Harvard University and the Getty Conservation Institute examined brown spots on the tomb walls that many had speculated were fungi. The research found these were actually pore-forming bacteria, still potentially dangerous but not the same as the deadly aspergillus found in the Polish king's tomb. Howard Carter's own records note that when the tomb was first opened, precautions were taken. The air inside was tested. No dangerous pathogens were identified at that time. Of course, the testing methods available in the 1920s were far less sophisticated than modern techniques, so this proves little either way. A more fundamental problem with the biological hazard explanation is that it would predict many more deaths than actually occurred. If the tomb truly contained pathogens, everyone who entered should have been at risk, not just a few individuals. But as we shall see when we examine the statistics, the reality is quite different. Still, the science is compelling enough that modern archaeologists now take biological hazards seriously. When excavating tombs or handling ancient materials, researchers wear protective equipment, including masks and sometimes full respirators. Tombs are ventilated before extended work begins. Samples are taken and analyzed for dangerous microorganisms. The lessons learned from both Tutankhamun's tomb and the disaster in Poland have changed how archaeology is practiced. Whether biological hazards explain all, some, or none of the Tutankhamun cursed deaths remains debated. What is clear is that ancient tombs are not entirely safe spaces. They can harbor genuine dangers. And for people with compromised health, entering such a space could indeed prove fatal, not because of magic or curses, but because of biology and bad luck. Debunking the curse. What the statistics actually show. For decades, the curse of Tutankhamun was accepted as fact by millions of people worldwide. The list of deaths seemed overwhelming. The coincidences appeared too numerous to be mere chance. But in 2002, a researcher decided to actually do the math. Mark Nelson, an Australian professor of epidemiology and preventive medicine at Monash University, published a study in the British Medical Journal that applied rigorous statistical analysis to the curse claims. His approach was simple but devastatingly effective. He identified everyone who was present in Egypt when the tomb was opened and divided them into two groups: those who had direct exposure to the tomb and its contents, and those who were in Egypt at the time but never entered or closely examined the tomb. If the curse was real, Nelson reasoned, the people in the first group should die significantly younger than those in the second group. The curse should show up as a measurable difference in mortality rates. Nelson identified 44 people total. 25 of them had direct exposure to the tomb, including everyone who entered the burial chambers during their opening. 19 were in Egypt but had no direct exposure. He then tracked what happened to all these people, recording their ages at death and calculating mean survival times. The results were unambiguous. There was no statistical difference in survival between the two groups. The people who entered the tomb did not die younger than those who did not. Looking specifically at the subset who were present at the opening of the burial chamber in February 1923, the average age at death was 70 years old. For the non-exposed group, it was 75 years old, a difference of 5 years, but well within the range of normal statistical variation and not remotely close to being statistically significant. Moreover, Nelson found no evidence that people exposed to the tomb were more likely to die within 10 years of exposure, as the curse legend would predict. If anything, the exposed group had slightly better survival at the 10-year mark, though again, the difference was not significant. The person who had the most exposure to the tomb, who spent more time in its chambers than anyone else, who handled more artifacts and breathed more tomb air than any other living person, was Howard Carter himself. If the curse was real, Carter should have been its primary target. He was the one who actually broke the seals, who first entered each chamber, who supervised every aspect of the excavation. Carter did not die in 1923 or 1924 or 1925. He did not die in the 1930s. He lived to complete the excavation of the tomb, to catalog its thousands of artifacts, to write detailed publications about the discovery. He died in March 1939 at his home in London at the age of 64. The cause of death was Hodgkin's disease, a form of lymphoma. He had lived for 17 years after first opening the tomb. 17 years of robust, active life. Lady Evelyn Herbert, Lord Carnarvon's daughter, was one of the first 4 people to peer into the antechamber on that November night in 1922. According to a story she told late in life, she was actually the first person to enter the sealed burial chamber, squeezing through the small opening because she was the smallest of the group. If anyone should have been cursed, it was her. She was present at both the initial discovery and the opening of the burial chamber. She handled artifacts. She breathed the tomb air. Lady Evelyn died in 1980 at the age of 78. She lived for 57 years after the tomb's opening. Of all the people present at that historic moment, she was one of the longest lived. The other 2 members of that initial group, Arthur Callender and Lord Carnarvon, had very different fates. Carnarvon, as we know, died 5 months after the discovery. But Callender, Carter's friend and assistant, who helped with much of the practical work, lived until 1936. He was 62 when he died, having survived 14 years past the opening. What about the wider circle of people connected to the excavation? The workers who actually did the digging, who moved the rocks and hauled the baskets and cleared the corridors? These Egyptian laborers were never mentioned in curse stories, perhaps because European and American newspapers of the 1920s rarely considered Egyptian lives newsworthy. But these men had more exposure to tomb dust and debris than anyone. They were the ones doing the physical labor, stirring up whatever spores and particles might have been present. We have no comprehensive records of what happened to these workers, but Carter's photographs show many of the same faces year after year throughout the excavation. The same men appear in pictures from 1922 and from 1928 and from 1932. They did not drop dead. They did not succumb to mysterious illnesses. They simply continued with their lives and their work. The statistical analysis makes clear what should have been obvious from the start. People die. In the 1920s and 1930s, without antibiotics or modern medicine, people died younger than they do today. Life expectancy for a European or American male in the 1920s was somewhere in the mid-50s. Many of the people on the curse list died at ages that were perfectly normal for their time. Some died younger, but others lived to old age. When you have a large group of people and you follow them over many years, some will die young and some will die old. Some will die of common diseases like pneumonia or cancer. Some will die in accidents. A few will die under unusual circumstances. This is simply how mortality works. It requires no supernatural explanation. The curse believers engaged in what statisticians call selection bias. They counted every death that could be linked to the tomb, no matter how tenuously, while ignoring everyone who survived. They noticed patterns that confirmed their belief while dismissing evidence that contradicted it. They remembered the dramatic deaths and forgot the boring survivals. Arthur Mace died at 53. Curse? But his colleague, Alfred Lucas, who spent as much or more time in the tomb doing chemical analysis and conservation, lived to be 79. Not cursed. Harry Burton, the photographer who documented everything, who spent more cumulative hours in those chambers than almost anyone, lived to be 60. A curse that killed some people, but not others, is not much of a curse. Even among the deaths that were counted, many involved people with pre-existing health conditions. Lord Carnarvon had damaged lungs. Arthur Mace had asthma. Sir Archibald Douglas Reed had cancer. though it had not been diagnosed before he visited the tomb. These were people who would have been at higher risk of death anyway, regardless of any tomb exposure. And what of the supposed immediate deaths? George J. Gould's death 6 weeks after visiting the tomb seems dramatic until you realize he was 59 years old, had a history of health problems, and died of pneumonia while traveling in Europe. Pneumonia was one of the leading causes of death in the pre-antibiotic era. People got sick and died from it all the time. The British Medical Journal study concluded with a statement that should have ended the curse debate once and for all. Quote, "We found no evidence to support the existence of a mummy's curse. The deaths attributed to the curse were, the study showed, nothing more than normal mortality, striking a group of middle-aged and elderly people living in the early 20th century." But of course, the curse legend did not end, because curses, like conspiracy theories, are remarkably resistant to mere facts. The story is too good, too dramatic, too satisfying to our narrative sensibilities. We want to believe that disturbing the dead has consequences. We want to believe that ancient magic still has power. We want to believe that there are mysteries science cannot explain. And there is perhaps nothing wrong with that, as long as we recognize it for what it is: a story, a legend, a modern myth that tells us more about ourselves and our fascinations than it does about ancient Egypt or about what actually happened in November 1922. The legacy: how the curse captured the world's imagination. Regardless of its factual basis or lack thereof, the curse of Tutankhamun has had a profound and lasting impact on popular culture and public perception of ancient Egypt. It transformed archaeology from an obscure academic pursuit into mass entertainment. It made Tutankhamun, a minor pharaoh who accomplished little during his brief reign, into one of the most famous people from the ancient world. And it created a template for mummy curses that still influences movies, books, and television shows a century later. The immediate impact in the 1920s was extraordinary. Tutankhamun became a household name. Songs were written about him. Fashion designers created Egyptian-influenced clothing and jewelry. Art Deco architecture and design incorporated Egyptian motifs. The discovery coincided with the rise of commercial radio and mass circulation newspapers, technologies that allowed the story to spread faster and wider than any previous archaeological find. The curse narrative gave people a hook, something they could understand and relate to, even if they knew nothing about Egyptology. Everyone understands the concept of a warning ignored, of consequences following a transgression. The curse fit into ancient storytelling patterns, the myth of forbidden knowledge, the tale of the treasure that brings doom rather than fortune. It resonated at a deep level. Hollywood quickly recognized the commercial potential. Universal Pictures released The Mummy in 1932, just 10 years after the tomb's discovery. Starring Boris Karloff as the revived mummy Imhotep, the film drew directly on Tutankhamun's tomb for inspiration, though the plot was entirely fictional. The movie was a huge success and spawned numerous sequels and remakes over the decades. Each iteration reinforced the idea of mummy curses in the public imagination. But the influence went beyond entertainment. The curse legend affected how people thought about archaeology and cultural heritage. Some Egyptians argued that the artifacts should never have been disturbed in the first place. The curse, real or not, represented a form of cosmic justice, punishment for the colonial arrogance of wealthy Europeans pillaging another nation's heritage. This perspective gained strength as the decades passed and attitudes toward colonialism shifted. By the 1960s and 1970s, many former colonies were demanding the return of artifacts taken during the colonial era. Egypt repeatedly asked for the return of certain items from Tutankhamun's tomb, though ultimately most remained in Egyptian museums. The curse became a metaphor for the costs of cultural appropriation and archaeological exploitation. The treasures themselves went on tour, creating Tutmania in multiple countries. A 1972 exhibition in London attracted over 30,000 visitors in its first week. The tour expanded to Russia, the United States, Canada, Japan, and France over the following years. Everywhere it went, Tutankhamun's golden mask drew massive crowds. People stood in line for hours just to glimpse the artifacts. The exhibition generated tremendous revenue and renewed interest in ancient Egypt. Some of this interest was serious and scholarly. Many young people who saw the exhibitions went on to study Egyptology or archaeology. Museums expanded their Egyptian collections. Universities established or strengthened their programs in ancient Near Eastern studies. In this sense, Tutankhamun's legacy has been overwhelmingly positive, inspiring generations of researchers who have expanded our understanding of ancient Egyptian civilization. But mixed with the scholarly interest was a persistent fascination with the curse. Each new death of anyone remotely connected to the tomb generated newspaper articles and speculation. The legend mutated and evolved, picking up new details with each retelling. Some versions claimed there had been a written curse in the tomb, even though no such inscription existed. Others alleged that the ancient Egyptians had deliberately booby-trapped their tombs with poisons or pathogens, turning them into biological weapons against future grave robbers. The curse influenced how archaeological sites were protected and presented. When replica tombs were created for tourists, allowing the originals to be preserved, the replicas often included dramatic presentations of curse warnings and mummy's revenge. Things that were never in the actual tombs, but had become expected parts of the Egyptian death experience in the popular imagination. Modern Egyptian tour guides, cognizant of what tourists expect, sometimes play up curse stories, even while acknowledging they are not historically accurate. It has become part of the performance, part of the experience of visiting Egypt's ancient sites. The curse is too embedded in global culture to simply dismiss. Scientifically, the Tutankhamun discovery revolutionized archaeology. Carter's meticulous documentation set new standards for excavation practice. His photographs, drawings, and detailed notes created an unprecedented record that researchers still consult today. The conservation techniques developed by his team, the challenges of preserving fragile organic materials after thousands of years in a sealed tomb, advanced the entire field of archaeological conservation. The discovery also spurred advances in scientific analysis of ancient materials. When researchers wanted to determine how old Tutankhamun was when he died, they developed new techniques for analyzing skeletal remains. When they wanted to understand what diseases he suffered from, they pioneered methods of extracting and analyzing ancient DNA. Each question about the boy king led to methodological innovations that could be applied to other archaeological discoveries. In recent decades, technology has allowed even deeper investigations. CT scans of Tutankhamun's mummy revealed details about his health and the possible causes of his death. DNA analysis confirmed his parentage and revealed the extent of inbreeding in his family line. Chemical analysis of residues in jars and vessels uncovered information about ancient Egyptian diet and medicine. Three-dimensional scanning created perfect digital models of artifacts, allowing researchers worldwide to study them without handling the fragile originals. Yet, even as science provides ever more detailed answers about Tutankhamun's life and death, the curse legend persists. Perhaps it persists precisely because the scientific answers, while fascinating, lack the narrative drama of a supernatural curse. We know now that Tutankhamun probably died from a combination of factors: genetic disorders from inbreeding, malaria, and possibly infection from a broken leg. That is the medical reality. But it is not a story that captures the imagination the way a curse does. The Tutankhamun phenomenon raises interesting questions about how we relate to the past. Why do we find ancient Egypt so fascinating? What draws us to these tombs and treasures? Part of it is surely the aesthetic appeal, the incredible beauty of the objects. the skill of the artisans. Part is the exotic nature of a civilization so different from our own, yet recognizably human. And part, perhaps, is a longing for mystery in an increasingly explained world. The curse narrative preserves that mystery. It suggests that despite all our technology and knowledge, there are still things we do not understand, forces we cannot control. In an age of scientific rationalism, the curse is a reminder of the irrational, a nod to the possibility that the universe is stranger and more dangerous than we like to think. Modern Egyptologists must navigate this tension between academic rigor and popular fascination. They must present accurate, evidence-based information about ancient Egypt, while acknowledging that much of their funding and public support comes from people whose interest was sparked by movies, novels, and yes, curse stories. It is a delicate balance. The tomb itself remains one of the world's great tourist attractions. Each year, hundreds of thousands of people descend into the Valley of the Kings to see the small tomb where the boy pharaoh was laid to rest. Many of the artifacts have been moved to the Grand Egyptian Museum near Cairo, where they are displayed in climate-controlled galleries with state-of-the-art security. But Tutankhamun's mummy remains in his tomb, resting in a climate-controlled glass case, his face visible to visitors who make the journey. Standing in that tomb, looking at the painted walls with their scenes of the pharaoh meeting the gods, it is easy to feel the weight of history. This is not a recreation or a replica. This is the actual place where ancient Egyptian priests performed the opening of the mouth ceremony. This is where Tutankhamun was sealed away for eternity. The walls that Howard Carter's candle illuminated in 1922 are the same walls visitors see today. Does it feel cursed? That depends on your perspective and perhaps your suggestibility. Some visitors report feeling uneasy or experiencing strange sensations. Others feel nothing but awe at the history surrounding them. The human mind is adept at finding patterns and interpreting experiences in ways that confirm our existing beliefs. If you expect to feel the presence of an ancient curse, you probably will feel something, even if it is just your own nervous system responding to the power of suggestion. What is certain is that the curse of Tutankhamun, whether real or imagined, has become an indelible part of how we think about ancient Egypt. It is a lens through which millions of people first encounter Egyptian history. And while it may not be scientifically accurate, while it may oversimplify or distort the actual story of the discovery, it has succeeded in keeping that story alive in public consciousness for over a century. In that sense, perhaps Tutankhamun did achieve a kind of immortality, not through his accomplishments in life, but through the circumstances of his death and rediscovery. He is remembered, his name is spoken, his image is recognized worldwide. For an ancient Egyptian, that was the ultimate goal, to be remembered, to have one's name endure. By that measure, the boy king succeeded beyond what anyone could have imagined. Conclusion: the enduring mystery. As we reach the end of our journey through the sands and shadows of Tutankhamun's tomb, what can we conclude about the curse that has fascinated and frightened people for over a century? The factual answer is clear. There was no curse inscription in the tomb. The deaths attributed to supernatural causes can be explained by natural factors: disease, old age, accidents, and the normal mortality of people living in the early 20th century. Statistical analysis shows no correlation between tomb exposure and early death. The people who spent the most time in the tomb generally lived long lives. The curse, as a supernatural phenomenon, simply does not exist. And yet, the story endures. It endures because it speaks to something deep in human nature: our fascination with death, our respect for the past, our suspicion that there are forces beyond our understanding. The curse is a story we tell ourselves, a way of making sense of coincidences, a reminder that disturbing the dead has always been considered transgressive across cultures and throughout history. There may be, as science suggests, genuine biological hazards in ancient tombs. Fungi, bacteria, Gases, these are real threats that archaeologists must take seriously. In that sense, there is a curse of sorts, not magical, but microbial. Lord Carnarvon's death, and possibly others, may well have been caused by pathogens released when the tomb was opened. That is not supernatural, but it is real, and it is dangerous. The story of Tutankhamun's tomb is ultimately a story about discovery and how we interpret it. It is about the collision between ancient and modern worlds, between sacred and secular, between myth and science. Howard Carter sought to understand the past through careful excavation and documentation. The newspapers sought to sell copies through sensational stories. The public sought meaning and mystery in an increasingly mechanized world. Each group found what they were looking for. For those of us listening tonight, the curse offers something else. It offers a good story, a tale worth telling on a dark night, a reminder that history is not just dry facts and dates, but living narrative full of drama and human emotion. Whether you believe in curses or not, the story of Tutankhamun's tomb captures the imagination in a way that few archaeological discoveries ever have. The boy king sleeps still in his valley, surrounded by the limestone cliffs and the desert silence. The tourists come and go. The scholars continue their research. The debates about his life and death and the meaning of his tomb continue. And somewhere in all of this, between the facts and the legends, between the science and the stories, lies a truth that is perhaps more important than either taken alone. The truth is that we are drawn to mysteries. We are fascinated by death and what lies beyond. We want to believe that the past still has power, that the dead are not simply gone, but somehow present. These are human needs, human desires that no amount of scientific explanation will fully satisfy. The curse of Tutankhamun gives those needs a shape, a story, a focal point. And in doing so, it keeps us connected to an ancient world that might otherwise feel impossibly distant. Whether the curse is real or not matters less than what it represents. Our ongoing conversation with the past, our attempt to understand those who came before us, our recognition that we too will one day become the subjects of future people's curiosity and speculation. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps with images of golden masks and shadowed chambers floating through your mind, remember this. Curses, like all stories, are what we make of them. They have the power we give them. And sometimes the most powerful magic is simply the ability of a good story to transport us across time and space, to make us feel connected to people who lived and died thousands of years ago. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the mysteries of ancient Egypt. If you enjoyed this exploration of Tutankhamun's tomb and its alleged curse, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. There are many more stories from the ancient world waiting to be told, and I look forward to sharing them with you. Until next time, sleep well, and may you dream of golden treasures and ancient wonders. Good night.